I also asked Historic England about the issue of arson at listed buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked them if Historic England keeps the records of cases where listed buildings and or other heritage assets are subject to suspicious fires. And I asked if they keep such records, how many active cases of suspected arson or unlawful damage or demolition of a listed building or other heritage asset is Historic England currently involved in or aware of as being under investigation.
Mm-hmm.
What they said I thought was quite interesting. The current data collected by the Home Office about fire incidents in England does not include or produce data sets that can identify fire incidents that have occurred in listed buildings or in conservation areas. Now, I find that interesting. Historic England added, we do collect data from a number of sources, but it's not yet fully comprehensive. So, in other words, they're aware of the issue, but for whatever reason, they haven't been able to start to build a comprehensive database yet. Now, this ties in with the fire. Another question that I asked them. I said, more generally, does Historic England share the view that deliberate destruction by owners stroke developers of listed buildings and buildings which may not be formally listed but which are heritage assets and which may be listed is a specific problem in heritage protection? And again, the reply I thought was really interesting. They said, we are currently developing our strategic approach to preventing and investigating deliberate fires and arson of listed buildings. So again,
Hello there, and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 7th of August, 2023. I am joined, as ever, by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and together, I think, we're both rather glistening in the heat of the day. It's a hot and humid day. Well, hot-ish. It's 22 degrees, but the humidity is high, and it's all I can think about. It's just...
This is a very British obsession we're here. It's the weather.
Yeah. Last week it was too wet. It was too rainy. You know, this week it's too hot. You just you cannot please us. Impossible.
No, and we're very conscious that around the world, and particularly on the island of Maui at the moment, there are people who have been suffering far more in the weather than our petty British obsessions with whether it's raining or not in the middle of August. But Put it, on the other hand, I would say in terms of our lead story this week, we're not nearly so hot as the Crooked House pub in Himley in the West Midlands.
That's all too true, and also hot in more ways than one, I suspect. This is not only about what's being investigated now as an attack, an arson attack on an 18th century pub that was famously wonky, crooked due to 19th century subsidence, because it's in the Black Country, so there's been mining nearby and it's affected the building. But also it's going to be a hot story, I think, for a little while, because what we're starting to see is major public outcry and pushback that's impossible to ignore. And it also possibly has implications for the broader pub culture and pub building culture across the country. But we can come to that in a little bit. This pushed almost everything off our agenda, didn't it, Andy? As soon as this happened, we were on it. We were watching it.
It has. It's interesting because last time we were talking about the major planning decision at Old Oswestry, which was highlighting issues with the planning system and potential shortcomings and potential wider implications to the national planning system as regards to historic sites, scheduled monuments, and ancient and listed buildings, and even before the ramifications of that have been fully understood and worked through, I think as we look at this issue, we'll see that the heritage sector is now facing another significant challenge to the assumptions that we all had about how effective planning and listing and building control might be.
Well, before we move on to then that story, do you want to briefly update us on anything that might be coming out of Old Oswestry? Because you talk about the need for to be aware of these challenges, and in that sense, for example, we praised the Council for British Archaeology for coming out prior to the decision around Old Oswestry very strongly. Is there any sign of people stepping up to the plate? How alert are people, and in particular our sector leaders and institutions, to these imminent issues, ongoing issues?
At one level, it's too soon to say, and I think we have to accept that we're in the middle of August or approaching the middle of August. Mm-hmm. It's the holiday season. People may not be at their desks and so on. At the same time, there has been relatively little response in public to the Old Oswestry decision, certainly in terms of a formulated response and any suggestion that it might be formally challenged. I hope we'll have more to say about that next time. Yeah,
me too. Notice I did that legal thing of asking a question to which I already knew the answer. So
it's a bit like a government consultation. You never consult the public unless you know what you want the public to say back to you.
Well, I mean, 2016 put pay to that, didn't it? No, where
the exception that proves the rule.
It was an advisory vote. It was an advisory. Anyway, so what would you? Where do you want to start on Crooked House?
Well, perhaps I should just start with the background, and particularly for people who might not be familiar with the area where the Crooked House stood, and the history of the area where the Crooked House stood, and also the current situation regarding the British hospitality industry, because these things are all interconnected. And then, of course, there's the issue of planning and listed buildings or heritage assets, which aren't necessarily listed under any kind of national scheme. So, new viewers start here, basically.
Okay.
I also need to put my cards on the table at the outset of this.
Do you own a pub?
No, but my niece's husband runs a pub.
Okay.
And but more importantly than that, we have family connections in the Black Country, where the Crooked House stood.
My condolences.
And in fact, it's a wonderful part of the world. And it is. And more to the point, I've actually visited the Crooked House.
Right. Okay.
The Crooked House, the Crooked House was an icon in the local community. I through family connections in the Black Country, I know people, for example, who visited it in the 1970s when it was a favourite for local bikers. Not in terms of the Hells Angels pub or anything like that, but it was quite remote, and people would go out there.
Go for a jaunt, stop off at the pub,
bike out there of a Friday or Saturday night. I am told that at the time the landlord there at the Crooked House would serve you a pint of snakebite even if you were sort of 14 or 15. It was really embedded in the local culture.
Right, okay.
And has now latterly it has moved upmarket, like a lot of pubs have tried to do, to try and broaden the clientele. And it was marketing itself, for example, as a wedding venue and a quite distinctive wedding venue. Now, up until March this year, the Crooked House was owned by a brewing and pub chain company called Marston's. Now, people who are fans of real ale will be familiar with Marston's Pedigree. It's an award-winning beer. But Marston's is basically a big business, like all major brewers are now. And it has an estate of pubs. One of the pubs was the Crooked House. Crooked House began life as a farmhouse in the 18th century. It appears to have been converted into a pub at some point in the 19th century. Certainly in the 20th century, it was functioning as a pub at the heart of what's called the Black Country. The Black Country is basically a region, broadly speaking, west of Birmingham in the Midlands, It was, I mean, people might be familiar with a place called Ironbridge Gorge. It's a World Heritage Site, which is sometimes called the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. Because of an accident of history and geology. Basically, the British Industrial Revolution, through coal mining, steel making, the development of factories for glass, pottery, and all sorts of other commodities that could then be distributed through the canal system, which grew up really in the latter half of the 18th into the early 19th century, and then the railways. The Black Country was a powerhouse of British industry. Where the Crooked House was unique was that, thanks to mining and quarry works in and around and under, it began to subside.
Yes.
And if you look at, and there's now extensive photographs online of what it looked like at various times in its history, including a BBC report from the 1970s, which we'll link to from a program called Nationwide, which visited the pub. It was seen as the wonkiest pub in Britain, the strangest pub in Britain, and so on and so on. It was nationally famous. Because if you look at the pictures, if you look at the front elevation, the windows are at something like sort of probably 10-15 degrees out of true, and the whole building is subsiding towards. If you look at the pictures of the old frontage, there are big brick buttresses on the to the left hand side of the building, just stopping it falling sideways. So
it does make me wonder about wedding parties. Like, would the photos have to be at an angle?
Corrected? Yes.
Obviously, if you're going there for the wonk, aren't you? Yeah.
That was the point. That was the point, and that's why I went there.
Yeah.
I'm not a native of that area. I've not lived in that area extensively. I lived to the east of Birmingham once for 18 months in Coventry, but and I've lived in the East Midlands, but not the West Midlands. I have family connections with, and one of the first visits when I started going to the Black Country was to the Crooked House. I was taken to the Crooked House. I actually, it was quite a shock actually, because I was looking at there's a 3D walkthrough of the building that was made before it was burnt out this week. And I recognised a wooden sort of dado rail that I rolled a 10-pence piece along, and the optical illusion is it was rolling uphill.
Oh, okay, yeah, I see.
That's one of the things that the Crooked House was famous for. One of the reasons you went there was not just because the building was crooked, but because of the nature of the subsidence and the internal fittings and so on. It gave rise to optical illusions that you could roll, a coin down the bar, but it would actually look as though you were rolling a coin up the bar.
So, and this is something that hasn't been entirely clear in the broader reporting, if you're not from the area or you haven't visited the place. So the effect of the tilt affected everything inside the building then as well. It wasn't just the exterior. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the joke was that if you had enough to drink, the building actually was straight.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It was a really important. It was an icon of that particular area, partly for what it was, and partly for what it represented as a knock-on effect, an unintended consequence of the Industrial Revolution in the Black Country. And again, culturally, even though the mining industry and the steelmaking industry are long gone, that area is still identifies very much with that period in its history. People might be familiar with a TV series called Peaky Blinders that is set in Birmingham, and it's largely filmed at the what's called the Black Country Museum, the Black Country Living History Museum in Dudley, where a number of period buildings either existed already or were moved to. And there are living history displays. It maintains craft skills like nail making and chain making. The anchor chains for the Titanic were actually made in the Black Country.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there are all these connections, which mean that a place like the Crooked House was imbued with far more than just its physical existence, if you like. It was emblematic. And I think maybe, given what's happened, it would appear certain people were maybe not as aware as they should have been of the consequences of what appears to have happened last weekend.
Yeah. Okay. So, how did we get to last weekend, I suppose? Because if the building was so beloved and so many people visited it and talked about it and enjoyed it, how did it come to be so neglected to the point where it was subject to an arson attack?
Right. Now, for that, we have to look at recent history and the recent history of the British hospitality industry. Now, the economics of pubs has been marginal for some time, as long as, in fact, for most of my adult life. There's a famous organisation called CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, which campaigns for the continuance of the traditional English pub. And I'll come back to some of their comments on this later. But basically, particularly since the COVID pandemic, when obviously pubs couldn't open, in spite of attempts by government to mitigate the worst of the economic impact of the COVID pandemic on the hospitality industry, many pubs were not for six by the loss of income over the period 2020 to 2022.
Yeah.
And coupled with that, problems with staffing, which to some degree at least are caused by the B word, Brexit. There's a shortage of people to work in the hospitality industry. And also changing habits. So, for example, you could buy beer more cheaply at a supermarket than you could over the counter at a pub, because the supermarket can absorb costs, whereas a pub has to charge for, has to pay for its utilities, it has to pay staff, and so on and so on and so on. The unit cost of a drink in a pub is greater than at a supermarket. Now, pubs offer other things as well, like sense of community, ability to talk to your friends, and so on. But basically, the traditional British pub, while it has on the whole been trying to move towards a more family orientated, more special social event orientated kind of industry, there have been that is a work in progress, and it means that a lot of pubs are on that journey, are vulnerable, and that appears to be what happened to the Crooked House.
Yeah.
Now, as I said earlier, back in March, Marston's, the brew company, the Brew Co., which owned the Crooked House as part of its estate, put on the market 61 pubs, all of which were being sold centrally by a single agent, and they were being sold for the most part as going concerns. Now, the reason for that is that under amendments to the planning laws, if a pub is functioning as a pub, it requires planning permission for change of use.
Right. Yeah.
So anybody buying a pub, at least initially, has to maintain its current use.
Okay.
And at the time it was sold, there was a landlord in residence at the Crooked House. The pub was open. It had a modernised kitchen, and it was operating as a wedding venue, and it was basically a functioning hospitality destination.
Okay.
Now, what happened next is where it starts to get murky, because in terms of what we know, as I say, Marston's put the pub on the market back in March.
Mm-hmm.
In June, while it's still for sale, there was what's described as a break-in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was a break-in that just happened to cause what has been reported as tens of thousands of pounds worth of damage, including to the kitchens, the bar, and the loos. Now, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that those are the three things that mean you can't open as a pub.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you haven't got a bar, if you haven't got loos, and if you haven't got a kitchen, if you're serving food and functioning as a wedding destination, you can't open. And in fact, following that break-in, the pub closed its doors.
Right.
Now, again, there is no proof that what happened on June the 25th, that break-in, was part of a deliberate plan.
No. Okay.
At the same time, people have, shall we say, noted the coincidence.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So the pub, as of late June, the pub is now closed because of the damage, but it's still for sale as a pub with the assumption it will be as a going concern. But July 27th, it's reported that the pub was sold on that date to an then unnamed buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was reported it was sold for, quote, alternative use. Now, that is a phrase that requires some interpretation because pubs are used for all sorts of alternative uses, from churches to old people's homes after a conversion, to flats after a conversion, to the sites being leveled and something new being built. Right. So, but basically, Bruco Marstons have offloaded it to a new owner.
Now, just for clarification, there, alternative use would be defined by who? Would that be a council, a local authority, sort of tax band issue, or something like
that? Under planning rules, pubs have a specific planning code, and under the planning rules, to change the code, for example, from a pub to residential, has to go through planning permission.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And depending on the level of the protection of the pub, for example, whether it's anything from listed as a local asset to a national heritage asset on the national list, grade 1, grade 2, grade 2 star, whatever, which some pubs are. The level of protection that's afforded varies. But the important thing is you can't just buy a pub and then change it into something else without a process of planning and negotiation with the local authority and going to planning.
So does that mean then that plans had been drawn up prior to sale?
Not that we're aware of.
Okay, right.
As things stand at the moment, that phrase sits in isolation.
I see.
It was reported that it was sold for alternative use, and that's where it stood.
Okay.
Now,
I mean, you can see why I'm getting sort of slightly hung up on that in some ways. I'm curious as to what that means and how it came about and how, it implies intent, doesn't it? Arguably, but I'm wondering how that can be defined. But anyway, it may not be that something that we're aware of at the moment. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, put simply, I think somebody wanted it out there that it was no longer seen as a viable pub and hospitality venue.
Okay.
The Crooked House, beloved of many people over many decades in the Black Country, was no longer going to be available as a pub.
Okay, right. Okay.
And how that would come about was still to be TBC.
Okay.
Barely a week later, on the night of 5th, 6th August, which is Saturday into Sunday weekend, when people's maybe attention is elsewhere, the Crooked House is gutted by a fire. Now, the local firefighters attending discovered that the single access road to the site was blocked, which meant that they couldn't get fire appliances up to the fire, and they had to lay hoses all the way back to the hydrants on the main road to enable them to fight the fire,
Right.
which may have hampered those efforts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So by the morning, the pub is basically a shell. But the main elements of the structure are still standing. Now, because this is now a public safety issue, amongst other things, the local authority, South Staffordshire, becomes involved. And officials from South Staffordshire meet the landowner and pub owner, as it now is, and discuss what's going to happen next. And this is again where it starts to get murky, because the local authority say that they gave permission for elements of the first floor structure to be demolished on safety grounds, but they didn't give permission for the whole building to be demolished because they didn't regard it as necessary or desirable.
No. Okay.
But the next thing we see on the Monday morning, Monday of this week, in fact, which is the 7th, I think, if my maths is right. Monday the 7th. Video is published on a local Facebook group showing a Hyundai 360 tracked excavator with a driver, and I've watched it a number of times now, at least 2 people observing, and one of them appearing to give instructions, watching the whole building basically being leveled. So it's now a pile of rubble.
Right.
Now, the context for this is that people were already calling for the pub to be rebuilt, either on site, brick by brick, restored, which is perfectly possible. Buildings that have been far more badly damaged have been restored and are now standing and functioning. Or alternatively, because it was so iconic of the region, at the Black Country Museum. Now, the Black Country Museum said basically, sorry, but we can't take it.
Yeah.
But there was a strong groundswell of opinion locally, including among senior local politicians like MPs, and particularly Andy Street, who's the elected mayor of the West Midlands, basically saying, the aim here should be a reconstruction, if necessary, brick by brick. Now, in terms of the legal situation, the pub is now a pile of rubble, but the local authority, South Staffs, confirm that it is that it was demolished basically without their consent, unnecessarily, and that they are investigating whether offences under the Town and Country Planning Act have been committed.
Okay.
So potential charges are now in play. The local police are also involved in the investigation, and having initially issued the standard statements about keeping an open mind and not speculating online and so on, they later, and relatively quickly actually, in the investigation, issue a statement that the case is now being treated as arson. So you have another set of offences in play. So by the middle of the week, by Wednesday, in play is the possibility that offences under the Town and Country Planning Act relating to the unlawful demolition have been committed, but also, and separately, we have to assume at the moment, because there's no connection between the two events that can be proven at the moment from information that's in the public domain, at least, that the initial fire was deliberate. And in fact, we know, and it appeared on local media and national media, in fact, the Fire and Rescue Service investigators deployed a trained sniffer dog who is trained to detect accelerants, petrol, other paraffin, whatever, that might have been used to start the fire.
Right.
It was also speculated that if somebody wanted to cover their tracks, having a building like that demolished might be helpful, because it might disguise the location of the seat of the fire, and in fact whether there was more than one. Because obviously if there's more than one seat of fire, the chances of it being accidental diminish.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's the situation by the middle of the week, but we still don't know who is involved in all this.
So just before you move on to that, I just want to clarify something for myself and also for the folks at home. So there's a fire overnight at the weekend, and then within 48 hours or thereabouts, the site is demolished, leveled, despite council advice that all they had to do is make it safe by demolishing aspects of the building. Was there no one on site to sort of monitor access from the point that the fire had been put out? I.e., this is a potential crime scene, isn't it? Like, wasn't there anyone there to monitor and also interpret, perhaps, for example, perhaps the council's minimum safety request?
Right. This is one of the many questions that surround this, because it would appear that following the fire, when the fire was out, the fire brigade and the police withdrew and handed the building back to its owner, having had this meeting where they'd agreed to a partial demolition of part of the first floor.
Okay.
For safety reasons. It then appears that the people who may or may not be connected with the owner moved in with a 360 excavator and leveled the site.
Yeah.
Exceeding the authority they've been given by South Staffordshire Council. Now, and again, as I say, what is also coming to the public domain at this time is that, and now I'm quoting here, Station Commander Hilton of the Staffordshire Fire Service, who said that there were mounds of mud and soil placed in the centre of the road and covering the whole of it, which meant his appliances couldn't get access to the incident. He said it was a good 800 metres to 1,000 metres distance, kilometre, that we had to get our water via a high volume pump. It worked very well once it was in place, but there was quite a lot of work involved. So, these questions are now floating around. You've got an owner who appears to have exceeded their authority. You have the one access road for firefighters is blocked, and it then emerges, thanks to some investigation by journalists, including journalists on the Mail, the Guardian, and others, that the new owner is in fact connected with a waste and landfill site that operates next door to the Crooked House.
Okay. Yeah.
Now,
notice, folks at home, I'm not saying anything there. Again, this is all a very live investigation. So go ahead. Yeah.
And that's why I'm being very careful in what I say.
Yeah.
And in fact, Staffordshire Police issued a statement in the last couple of days where they asked people not to speculate online, saying it was unhelpful. And the reason for that is, it can, for example, prejudice a future trial,
exactly,
or even whether charges can be brought.
Yeah.
So this is why we're having to be very careful, even though there are no charges at the moment. No individuals have been named in connection with this investigation. There's even having been invited to the station to answer questions. It is now in the public domain, and I'm saying this without any kind of inference at all, that the buyer of the Crooked House is a firm called ATE Farms Limited. Now, the person who is named at Companies House as owning ACP Farms Limited, is a woman called Carly Taylor. Now, Carly Taylor is a former hairdresser and nail technician who is married to a gentleman who was a director of the of the landfill company and the quarry company, which is called Himley Environmental Limited.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it has 37 acres of quarry and landfill right next to the pub. So there you have a direct connection in terms of property. Now, Ms. Taylor is the director of multiple companies. Some of them have been struck off. Some of them are still extant. And interestingly enough, ATE Farms Limited operate out of the same address as Himley Environmental Limited.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I shall let people draw their own inferences from that.
Yeah, these are facts that you're stating, yes.
These are facts that I'm stating.
Yeah.
Now, again, without naming the client, Construction News, which is an industry magazine, reported yesterday, Thursday the 10th, that they had spoken to the hire company which hired the Hyundai 360.
Okay.
And because people were saying, wait a minute, if the road was blocked and the fire engines couldn't get down there, how the heck did somebody get down there with a 360, which you'd need to deliver with a low loader if it wasn't local?
With the plant, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. It now turns out that the 360 was ordered approximately a week before the fire to a client on account. And that client appears to have been the landfill site.
Okay.
Now, again, I have to stress there's no connection between the two things. There are many legitimate reasons why you need a 360 excavator on a quarry and landfill site.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But put it this way, in terms of doing what the owners appear to have felt they needed to do to the Crooked House, it was it would have been very convenient to have a 360 available locally and not have to be delivered.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I've heard that there was also some prior conversation about the road itself as an access point to what had been the pub.
Yeah.
Is that because the road bordered onto the land of the new owners?
Right. Now I'm reporting work that was done by the Mail, by the Mail. And the Mail, in its reporting, and national newspapers do have responsibilities that they do take seriously. Even the Mail can take seriously.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Mail's got quite a good track record in investigating things. Not always in a way that we'd like, but they have journalists who are very good at it. And they reported local sources saying that there was a dispute between the landfill, the owners of the landfill, and Marston's, predating the sale, about the use of the access road.
Right. Yeah.
And it was also stated on local social media, and again, this is purely anecdotal, that some public footpaths in the area may have been blocked. Now, again, there's no connection there between the landfill site and so on. It's an observation that maybe there have been attempts to stop people using paths and access roads in the area by certain entities.
Okay. So, and as we were discussing off camera yesterday, I think that is part of the culture of land ownership in certainly in England and Wales. Scotland has a different relationship in terms of right to roam and this kind of thing, but it's certainly landowner first, and landowners have a right, for example, to grant or indeed to deny access to their land for the most part. But given that the land and the property on the land in this particular instance were owned by people who presumably also insured the building, etc., this kind of thing, what was the state of play in terms of monitoring, security, safety of those valuable assets?
Right. Now, as I said, the police faced questions after this happened on Monday, saying, "Wait a minute, basically, why was there no monitoring? Why was there no security when this is a potential crime scene? And again, not naming anyone as suspects, but you have a suspicious fire at a heritage building, albeit one that's not listed, and it may or may not be connected that the access road for firefighters have been blocked. Right? So on Tuesday, Staffordshire Police, through one of their senior officers, Chief Inspector Chris Cotton, said that on Sunday, a cordon had been temporarily placed around the building while inquiries were carried out. But then, quote, due to the unsafe structure of the building, officers were pulled back and the scene was stood down. He then said, and this is where it gets really interesting. Since then, the area has been in the care of the landowners and the building has since been demolished. And he added that speculation as to the cause of the fire is not helpful at this time. Now, a lot of people thought, wait a minute, okay, the building might have been unsafe, but you can put a cordon at a safe distance.
Yeah, 50
and
meters.
This was absolutely, and this was a potential crime scene. So, there's no answer to that question at the moment. It may well come out in due course, as I suspect the responses to this incident are going to be looked at in detail for some time to come.
Well, do we know how secure the site was? I mean, the access road was blocked. Was it locked up? Were there any security cameras? Like, what can we say about that?
Now, here I need to step back a little bit, but only a week or so, just over a week or so. Because on Wednesday, the Mail reported that they'd spoken to a local school teacher called Stephen Banfield. Now, he said that he'd visited the site with the idea of taking photographs on July the 28th. Now, that's the day that the sale appears to have been announced anyway. The timeline on completion, handing over keys and so on is not clear.
Okay.
But certainly that's the day that the sale appears to have gone public. And Mr. Banfield says that when he got there to take his pictures, he found that the door was open and there was no security on the site in place. Now, you don't need to be sure.
So he could just wander in then off the street.
That's right. That's right.
Interesting.
And in fact, he says he contacted the police, but was only recontacted by the police the day after the fire when officers asked him to send in his photographs.
Right.
Now, you don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to realise that an isolated pub that is wide open to anybody to wander in is vulnerable.
Yeah.
And more to the point, if the door is open, you're not committing an offence of breaking and entering. But
well, hence the reason that security companies typically ask you to make sure your property's locked.
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a simple. It's the most simple basic security precaution that any of us can take. You have charge of any kind of property, right? Now, interestingly, Mr. Banfield said that, and I'm quoting here from the Mail article, I found it really strange that someone would spend all that money, and the pub was on publicly at £375,000, nearly approaching £750,000. That someone would spend all that money and then not secure it. It's in a very remote location. I knew it was a sitting duck. I contacted the police as it was playing on my mind because of the building's history and how vulnerable it was. And in fact, that apparent lack of concern on the part of the police has caused ripples, shall we say, among local politicians. The MP for the adjacent constituency, Marc questioned why the police hadn't intervened in the demolition, for example, given that there was an investigation into the fire that was ongoing. And he said, for example, quote, if the police were investigating the fire incident, then why would the site be demolished whilst the police are conducting their inquiries, which may possibly require forensic examinations to gather evidence?
I mean, again, no implication of guilt here, but if someone is found dead in someone's house, you don't just allow the owner of the house to clean up their house, whether you suspect
No.
them or not of doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
It just don't. Yeah, yeah. So it is odd in that sense. Or well, in retrospect, it seems odd. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now, and again, I'll loop back to uh, the links with the landfill site. Somebody, an unnamed source, told the Mail, and this is in quote marks,
Mm-hmm.
so it means this is what the source told them in newspaper, subtext.
Mm-hmm.
A source told the Mail Online that the purchase was, quote, all about access,
Right.
and that followed disagreements between the landfill company and Marston's over the access road to the pub, which was shared.
Oh, I see. So it didn't just border onto their land. It was an access route to their. It is
Yes.
an access route to their quarry and landfill business. Okay.
Yes,
Interesting.
but it was the public access road to the Crooked House.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Again, these are facts. Yes.
These are facts. In terms of the events of the weekend,
Hmm.
we've got fire brigade video and drone footage and so on of the fire. We've also and the aftermath of the fire, but we've also got social media reporting,
Mm-hmm.
and key to that we've got video of virtually the entire demolition process that was posted anonymously
Hmm.
on, as I say, a local Facebook community group.
Hmm.
And that's what, for example, gave away the identity of the hire company that supplied the Hyundai 360. So, and other people have posted images on social media of them visiting the site. There was even a vigil at the site when several hundred people came out on Tuesday evening
Mm-hmm.
to protest about what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
So the site has not been secure.
A watching brief is a formal program of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
This is a sort of a long and murky story. So perhaps this is the best thing to do now is to up some where we've got to at the time of recording, which is what midway through the afternoon on Friday, the 11th of August.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The first half of the week was full of statements from the authorities involved, from local politicians, and a growing groundswell of really real anger among from local people. The latter part of the week, the story has gone increasingly national, with national bodies like the Campaign for Real Ale becoming involved, the Campaign for Pubs, which campaigns for pubs to be preserved as community assets,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And I'll touch on those things in a minute. But basically, where we stand at the moment, there is a live police investigation by South Staffordshire Police, which is treating the fire as potential arson.
Mm.
So a criminal investigation, effectively.
Mm. Mm.
Unconnected with that at the moment, the local authority is investigating whether there have been offences under, for example, the Town and Country Planning Act and an unlawful demolition without planning permission.
Okay. Okay.
What is not in play at the moment is any potential charges under heritage legislation,
Mm-hmm.
because although it's been reported that the Crooked House was listed and or even was being considered for listing, in fact, it was never listed. I fell into this trap earlier on in the week, and when I first started looking at it, There is a listed Crooked House pub, which I think misled a number of people.
Right.
Hands up, I didn't fact check properly, and when I first reported it, I suggested that the Crooked House at Himley in the West Midlands, in the Black Country, was listed. It wasn't.
No.
And that does impact on the potential protections and potential charges of anyone damaging it or destroying it.
Well, that said, though, there is a, as you often say, realpolitik here, in so much as if there's a significant groundswell of outcry, which so far it seems as though there is, there may well be pressure put to do the sort of restorative work that otherwise would be mandated by law if a site was listed or protected in some other way.
Yeah. Now, look, okay, this is, and there are precedents, and we've covered them on Watching Brief. In fact, we might link to the Watching Brief episodes where we did cover these particular issues. But in terms of the Crooked House, first of all, the Georgian group, which is an expert group, has stated publicly on its Twitter account that it was in discussions over the potential listing of the Crooked House at Himley in the Black Country.
Okay.
Now,
how widely known were these discussions?
Well, this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
I spoke to Historic England yesterday and asked them, was Historic England aware that the building was being proposed for listing by the Georgian group? And if so, was Historic England in contact with the owner of the Crooked House? Now, Historic England responded, we don't disclose applicants, but I can confirm that none of the applications are from the Georgian group or an organisation. We were not in contact with the owner. Now, what that says is that there have been possibly a number of applications for listing, probably coming from individuals.
Right, I see, yeah.
Now, that could be individuals connected with the Georgian group, or it could be just members of the public in the Black Country who were concerned that the pub might be lost. And there has been a suggestion, for example, that if the landowner or the owner of the pub had been tipped off that it was being considered for listing, that might be a motive to advance having the site destroyed. That's happened in the past.
Yeah.
So now we're not saying that that's happened here.
No.
At all. There's no evidence for that at the moment. But in the case of the Carlton Tavern in Maida Vale in London, the pub was about to be listed, and the owner sent the bulldozers in, and the site was levelled.
Yeah.
There, the local planning authority, basically, there was a huge outcry. The local planning authority, which I think was Westminster, if I remember correctly, basically said that was an illegal act, and you must restore the pub brick by brick to exactly as it was before you sent the bulldozers in. And in fact, the Carlton Tavern is now reopened as a pub and hospitality venue.
It's not an easy process, though. I think, as we probably discussed in that instance, that's an extremely expensive undertaking. Yeah,
absolutely, and it was done at the cost of the developer.
Yeah,
to the cost of the and it's certainly more expensive than simply fining them for an unlawful demolition. Now, I think it's fair to say that in the last couple of years, the consequences for developers who try this one on have risen. It used to be the case, people would argue, would allege, that the worst that would happen would be a rap on the knuckles and a fine that would be just factored in as the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And they get to build their care home or their student flats or whatever it is they wanted to build on the pub site.
Yeah.
Subsequent to the Carlton Tavern, we've also had the case of the Punch Bowl in Lancashire, I think it was, wasn't it? Which again was
a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, we covered it exactly within the last few months. It was Grade 2 listed. The site owner was in an argument with the local authority over planning permission. They wanted to demolish it. They weren't getting planning permission, so they went ahead and demolished it anyway. And as things stand at the moment, they've been instructed to rebuild.
And in that instance, pertinent or not, they owned land next to the pub site and they wanted to demolish it in order to expand their holiday home letting business.
That's exactly
Yeah.
the circumstances. Now,
Yeah.
again, we must not draw parallels
These are,
with
this
the
is a different
situation here.
case, but yeah.
It's a different case,
Hmm.
but these are the kind of considerations that some landowners and developers will take into consideration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to finish on actually on Historic England's
Hmm.
point of view, that they point out that the building wasn't listed and it's no longer standing, so it can't be protected through listing. Again, that's another issue, that while the shell of the building was standing and the characteristic wonk was still there and still visible,
Hmm.
there could have been an application for emergency listing because of its cultural significance locally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because a structure doesn't have to be complete and functioning to be listed.
Right.
Otherwise, you couldn't list a ruin or schedule a ruined castle or anything like that.
Does that does that though, interesting? Just as a point of interest, does that come with the provision that it is listed as it is, and therefore restoring the building would take it out of that bracket?
If the structure was listed,
Hmm.
and this is hypothetically, okay, a burnt out but significant heritage building
Hmm.
is listed
Mm-hmm.
as an emergency listing, so it's
Yeah.
not lost forever.
Mm-hmm.
Two things can happen. The owner can apply for a certificate of immunity from listing,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
they have to argue that through process.
Yep.
It could go ahead and be listed,
Mm-hmm.
but then if you want to make any changes, that requires listed building consent. Now, I can't conceive of any circumstances, or very many circumstances, where, for example, Historic England would oppose the rebuilding of something like the Crooked House.
Right. Okay.
Because it would actually potentially rebuilding it as it once was would actually enhance its heritage value.
Whereas if you wanted to build it in glass bricks, for example, that would
Yeah,
require. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm thinking. I think it's Up Ark House in Sussex, for example. It was burnt out. National Trust property was rebuilt as facsimile.
Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't. They chose to rebuild it rather than just leave it as a ruin, as
Okay.
a burnt out ruin. That said, there are properties that are owned by, for example, English Heritage, which Whitley Court in the Midlands was burnt down, I think, in the 1920s. But the shell of the house is listed.
Right. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Anyway, so you were going to say, I interrupted you there.
No. So basically, Historic England are involved at two levels.
Mm-hmm.
They said that though the building wasn't listed and is no longer standing, it can't be protected through listing, but we don't have a formal role here. But they add, we have offered support to South Staffordshire Council and are ready to provide specialist advice as needed. Now, that specialist advice isn't just about heritage factors. It's also involved with the Historic England's increasing role in what is called heritage crime.
Right, yes.
Because the willful destruction by arson of a heritage asset, like the Crooked House, albeit one that's not listed, a building that's of cultural importance to the local community and arguably wider, that is a heritage crime.
Right. Yeah.
And arguably the total destruction of what was left is also a heritage crime. And it's since 2019, under sentencing guidelines which are available to judges, heritage crime is an aggravating factor when you're sentencing somebody who's been convicted of, for example, arson.
Right.
So anybody, if it did come to charges, and somebody personal persons were found guilty of committing the act of arson, or even over the unauthorized demolition, any sentence, whether it be a fine or custodial or both, is likely to be greater than it would be otherwise, because of the heritage implications being an aggravating factor. Yeah.
Well, yeah. developers beware, I guess. And to be fair, developers should, or landowners, property owners should always beware of these things. But yeah, it's a sticky wicket. I mean, are we presumably going to see how this unfolds over time? Again, what we've stated here are facts. We're not necessarily presuming anything in terms of what happens next, I guess, because we don't know. But we'll keep an eye on it.
I mean, certainly, I think we talked about the responses. The campaign for pubs have written a letter to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who was quite happy to be seen at the Canberra Great British Beer Festival last week, pulling a pint, saying basically that pubs need more protection and need legal protection, including from this kind of thing. The pubs are significant community assets, not just because people can go and buy a drink there, but because they allow a comfortable location for for example, people who might be socially isolated to go and meet people and talk and whatever. They're far more important than just a place to go and have a pint.
Yeah, conversations, wakes, meetings.
Absolutely. Yeah, weddings as the Crooked House was promoting itself to host. That I think the destruction of the Crooked House, for whatever reason, it's sort of catalyzed this argument. It's become increasingly seen as a national issue as the week's gone on. In the Black Country, as I say, two local MPs. The other main local MP is Gavin Williamson, former Education Secretary, who we've talked about a number of times on the Watching Brief. But he's also got behind the campaign, the questions that local people are arguing, and the campaign to have the Crooked House rebuilt. And perhaps most significant is the elected mayor Andy Street, because he has a direct involvement in crime and policing. And although it's just outside his jurisdiction, there's a lot of crossover. So his calling. There hasn't been that I've seen a comprehensive readout from it yet, but there was suggestions that he was going to be meeting South Staffordshire Council yesterday to discuss this case specifically and ways to move forward. Another thing is, again, if you look at the social media coverage of this, there are a lot of people who are saying, but in Glasgow or in Birmingham or in this is not an unusual story. What's unusual is that, and we can argue about why it is, but this story seems to have touched the national nerve. It's gone viral. We've even got a new poem from Pam Ayres, the popular poet who used to appear on television, writing poems about current affairs and so on. She's written published a poem on Twitter this week about the Crooked House. This is it's touching people even who never went there. And as I said, right at the beginning of this conversation, and why I've been following it up so closely on the Pipeline's Twitter account, and I'm writing a piece about it at the moment. It's personal. Particularly if you've been there, it was just this wonderful, quirky thing that people deserve to have the chance to go and visit and enjoy. Yeah, and. But in terms of the wider issues, Historic England, I also asked Historic England about the issue of arson at listed buildings. And I asked them if Historic England keeps the records of cases where listed buildings and or other heritage assets are subject to suspicious fires. And I asked, if they keep such records, how many active cases of suspected arson or unlawful damage or demolition of a listed building or other heritage asset is Historic England currently involved in or aware of as being under investigation? What they said I thought was quite interesting. The current data collected by the Home Office about fire incidents in England does not include or produce data sets that can identify fire incidents that have occurred in listed buildings or in conservation areas. Now, I find that interesting. Historic England added, we do collect data from a number of sources, but it's not yet fully comprehensive. So in other words, they're aware of the issue, but for whatever reason, they haven't been able to start to build a comprehensive database yet. Now, this ties in with the fire. Another question that I asked them. I said, more generally, does Historic England share the view that deliberate destruction by owners stroke developers of listed buildings and buildings which may not be formally listed but which are heritage assets and which may be listed is a specific problem in heritage protection? And again, the reply I thought was really interesting. They said, we are currently developing our strategic approach to preventing and investigating deliberate fires and arson of listed buildings. So again,
Come on. I mean, come on. How long have fires been happening? Like, they've been happening since before people were building things. For crying out loud. Sorry. That's me being. I'm a little bit warm. I'm a little bit irritated, I guess. But that's weird, isn't it? Isn't it? Why isn't that already in place?
put it this way, I'm not surprised at those answers, but I think it's regrettable that that data isn't available. Now, we can argue about why that...
Is this related to what we were talking about a few minutes ago in terms of landowners and land and ownership being a primary factor as opposed to owned things being seen as public goods?
Put it this way, I think it can be argued that in the current climate, where planning is such a live political issue, and you could argue where political parties, not just the Conservatives, but principally the Conservatives, get large donations from property developing companies and the building trade, that too powerful a magnifying glass being pointed at this issue might produce some information that's inconvenient.
You mean it might be inflammatory?
That is one way of putting it.
Okay, yeah.
I'll add one other point, because having had those answers, I asked finally if Historic England believes it has the resources and the legal tools to deal with the issue proactively. Now, what they said, again, was Historic England has a strong partnership with the National Fire Chiefs Council, NFCC. That's the overall representative body for the heads of fire and rescue organisations around the country. And the owners and managers of historic sites and buildings across the country. Recent fires at Dalby Mill in Bradford, Hermitage Mill in Mansfield and Bristol Docks have been investigated and offenders have been identified by local police services. In 2019, they make the point that I raised earlier in connection with the Crooked House investigation, that they say that we negotiated a change in sentencing guidelines for criminal damage and arson if the damage relates to a historic site or building. That will lead to enhanced sentence on conviction.
Right, yeah.
So, again, watch this space. Whether this will be an issue that's allowed to shrink back down the agenda as the days and weeks go past, and bearing in mind that official investigations invariably take much longer than people in the public would expect or certainly like.
Speaking of which, there's a change.org petition going around asking for a public inquiry. That's entirely out of the question at this point. It has to be criminally investigated first, doesn't it?
And that's the point. Public inquiries aren't the best tool. I can understand why people have asked for that, and I think we can read between the lines of that petition, and certainly on social media. And I've been reading a lot of social media this week about this locally on specialist groups like camera groups and things like that. And there is a real head of steam, a real sense of anger and frustration. First of all, that this happened in the first place, and secondly, that when it appears to be a slam dunk to somebody looking at it from the outside, that certain people have certain very specific questions to answer. Why haven't those questions been asked? Why haven't there been any arrests, etc.? That's not how it works.
No. So people have to be patient and just keep an eye on it. Yeah.
That's right, and it is incredibly frustrating. And again, cards on the table. I've worked on not an investigation into an arson incident, but a heritage crime investigation where it was immensely frustrating to the length of time that things took, and this was pre-COVID backlog. The length of time that things took, and then the fact that ultimately the Crown Prosecution Service chose not to prosecute on certain charges which which arguably could have been prosecuted.
Mm.
There are lots of checks and balances within the system, and so it's a. But at the same time, I would say I think it is pretty clear that all the authorities, all the organisations involved in this know that they're being watched.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think anything that smacks of certainly a cover-up, where not necessarily to protect individuals, but a cover-up to protect the response of certain organisations, shall we say,
Mm-hmm.
That they are going to be held to account on that.
Mm.
And and it may be that once the criminal investigations have been completed and any cases have gone to trial, there will be reports and lessons learned from what happened to the Crooked House, because it shouldn't have happened.
No, and yeah, and that's why we've dedicated the whole show to it this week, and we'll be keeping an eye on it. We have therefore delayed our examination of developments in Poland and also the Treasure Act here home. We have an upcoming conversation to be had about that Western Australian heritage law that we did a special on with Reese a little while ago, that he flagged as being potentially problematic, and seemingly it was almost precisely what he suspected it might be in terms of its problems. And I think there are a couple of other things as well on the horizon, not least as well, and I'm going to say it, the thing that I really want to talk about. It's been 6 months, man. I'm desperate to talk about the thing, but things keep on turning up that we can't, so we keep on pushing it back. So plenty on the horizon, folks. This has been this week's Watching Brief. If you have any additional thoughts, comments, or indeed specific information about this particular case, please do feel free to contact us. There's an email on screen below. You can contact Andy in various ways, also very secure ways as well. You can see those details on the Pipeline website. And keep the conversation below as civil as possible. And also, again, just for to completely avoid any misunderstandings, what we presented here was a series of facts. We don't know what happened, and neither do you folks. So try and keep the conversation along those lines as well. Yeah.
Can I add one thing just as we sign off, Mark? And that is, I started off by talking about the problems of the hospitality industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say to our viewer, if you have a local pub, bar, cafe, support it. Because once they're gone, you're very unlikely to get them back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for your time at home. Thank you, Andy, as well for your time. Until next time, folks, do take care. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.